Everyone feared her. The moment she walked into a room, the air seemed to tighten, and conversations fell silent. She had that presence, the kind that made people shrink just a little, as if they might vanish if they didn't move carefully. No one dared to speak unless spoken to, and even then, they tiptoed around every word, afraid it could be the wrong one. She was beautiful, yes, but it wasn't beauty that intimidated people. It was the sharpness in her eyes, the way she seemed to measure every move, every glance. It was like she could see right through you and find every little flaw. She was the billionaire's bride, and in the circles they moved, she had earned a reputation that preceded her. The wealthy, the powerful, the people who normally walked with confidence. Around her they hesitated. Employees in her mansion whispered stories to each other, tales of temper flaring without warning, of impossible demands made in the blink of an eye. Waiters who had served her once shared how she would send dishes back for the smallest mistake, how she would glare so intensely that some felt their very soul was being questioned. These stories were shared quietly, but they spread quickly. Fear clung to her name like a shadow. No one remembered the first time they felt that fear, but everyone remembered it vividly. It was the way she entered a restaurant, the way she sat without saying a word, as if expecting perfection to flow naturally around her. People would fumble menus, misplace glasses, and even forget to breathe in her presence. Some employees didn't last a week. They would leave, quietly, their pride and confidence deflated, unable to navigate the tension that followed her like a silent storm. It wasn't just the staff who were intimidated. The wealthy friends she entertained, the guests who dined in her presence, they all adjusted their behavior. Conversation became careful, laughter polite and measured. People began avoiding spontaneous comments, knowing that a stray joke or a misplaced compliment could trigger a look that froze the room. She had a way of controlling an atmosphere without raising her voice, a skill that made people wary and vigilant. The feeling wasn't anger exactly, it was a kind of sharp expectation. You didn't make mistakes around her. You didn't slip. You didn't falter. And if you did, it was as if she had been waiting, watching just to confirm it. Employees in her household worked under a quiet pressure. From the housekeepers to the chefs, everyone knew the story before they even started. They had heard the tales, seen the aftermath of someone failing to meet her standards. Some arrived with hope, thinking they could handle it, thinking they could navigate her world. But it didn't take long to realize that every action, every step, every smile had to be measured, weighed, and calculated. A frown or a sigh could lead to a cold silence that lasted hours, and no one knew if or when it would end. Her presence was everywhere, even when she wasn't in the room. Staff would recall past mistakes, rehearse the right way to serve a glass of water, the right way to fold napkins, the correct angle to place silverware. The tension wasn't just for her benefit. It was a pressure that shaped the entire environment. They feared not just her, but the ripple effect of displeasing her, the consequences that followed. She had created an aura that was as invisible as it was powerful, one that made people second-guess every decision. No one dared to speak out of turn. Requests had to be clear, precise, and flawless. Simple questions like whether she preferred her coffee with milk or cream were approached with caution, as if the answer itself could become a test. The atmosphere in her presence was always charged, a mixture of anticipation and anxiety, as if everyone was waiting for a storm that might never come, yet was always expected. Even the most confident individuals, those who were used to commanding rooms themselves, felt a chill when she entered. It was a subtle power, one that didn't need words to communicate dominance. Fear, respect, and a strange kind of admiration mingled together, creating a tense cocktail that everyone could taste but none could touch. Guests at restaurants whispered among themselves. They shared stories of her demands, the unspoken rules she enforced, and the discomfort that came from navigating her expectations. People marveled at her elegance, yes, but more so at the way she seemed untouchable. She had an air of mystery, a precision in her movements, and a sharpness in her speech that made her untouchable, unapproachable, yet fascinating. Everyone feared what they didn't understand, and no one understood her. There were moments when people caught glimpses of her softer side, Fleeting seconds when a smile or a pause suggested she was human, approachable even. But those moments were rare and brief, leaving the staff more anxious than reassured. If even a hint of warmth appeared, it could vanish instantly, replaced by the cold calculation they had learned to expect. Employees spoke in hushed tones about these moments, wondering if they had imagined them, questioning whether kindness had ever truly existed in her presence. In the midst of all this fear, life went on. Staff adapted, creating systems to anticipate her every need. They learned to watch her, to read subtle cues that indicated satisfaction or displeasure. They studied her habits, memorized her preferences, and rehearsed interactions to avoid mistakes. It was exhausting work, a constant balancing act on a tightrope they could never fully relax on. And still, some never survived more than a few weeks before the tension became too much. Others persevered, but the fear never fully left them. Outside of her immediate environment, the stories followed. Other restaurants, friends, and acquaintances of the wealthy shared tales of the feared bride, warning newcomers to tread carefully. People entered her presence already aware of the stakes, carrying with them the anxiety of stories told by those who had encountered her before. The fear was compounded, layered upon itself, and became a part of her legend. She wasn't just a person. She was an event, a test, an experience that demanded careful attention. Even the most seasoned staff members had moments of doubt. They questioned whether they had done enough, if a tiny misstep had gone unnoticed, if a glance had betrayed impatience or frustration. Their own minds became battlegrounds of fear and anticipation, long before any interaction occurred. They walked on eggshells, not because she threatened them directly, but because of the silent power she wielded, the invisible force that shaped behavior with nothing more than presence and expectation. This was the world she inhabited and the world she created for those around her. Everyone feared the billionaire's bride, not simply for her demands or temper, but because she had a way of making the ordinary feel monumental. Every gesture was observed, every reaction noted, and every small misstep remembered. People didn't just serve her. They navigated her, trying to anticipate what she wanted before she even knew it herself. And in that navigation, the fear grew, binding everyone together in a tense, invisible web. Yet despite all this, there was a part of everyone that wondered if anyone could ever truly reach her, understand her, or make her feel at ease. If someone could, it would require patience, skill, and a deep understanding of human nature. It would require courage, empathy, and a calmness under pressure that few possessed. And so, the story of fear continued, building layer upon layer of reputation, until the day a new presence entered the scene. A presence that would unknowingly challenge everything everyone had believed about the feared billionaire's bride. It was a busy evening when she arrived at the restaurant for her first shift. The place was buzzing with the usual energy of diners and the quiet panic of the staff who knew what the night might bring. Among the team was a young waitress who had just started. She carried a calmness that was unusual in such a high-pressure environment. Her hands moved with confidence, her eyes scanned the room carefully, and her smile was warm but not forced. She had heard the stories about the billionaire's bride, but she refused to let fear rule her movements. As the evening progressed, whispers of the bride's arrival spread through the restaurant. The staff straightened, their voices lowering, their steps careful. The atmosphere shifted immediately, as it always did. Everyone knew the signs. The hush in the dining room, the sudden precision of movements, the collective anticipation of what was to come. The new waitress felt it too, but she did not hesitate. Instead, she prepared herself quietly, taking note of every detail, every subtle cue that might help her navigate the encounter. When the bride entered, the room seemed to hold its breath. She moved with elegance, her eyes scanning the room as if judging everything in sight. The chatter faded, and even the clinking of glasses became almost muted. Staff members froze, unsure of what to do first. It was the moment they had all been warned about, and many felt the weight of expectation pressing down on them. Yet, the new waitress approached with a calm smile and a polite greeting, her voice steady and pleasant. She did not overdo it, did not fluster or fawn, and that alone caught the attention of the bride. The bride paused, just for a moment, as if assessing the young woman before her. There was no anger, no immediate judgment, just a quiet measurement. The waitress remembered small details from the previous visits that she had observed. The type of tea preferred, the position of the napkin, the angle at which the silverware should be placed. She applied this knowledge naturally, without seeming rehearsed, and served with care that was noticeable but unobtrusive. As the evening continued, subtle changes began to appear. The bride's usual sharp expressions softened slightly. She acknowledged the attentiveness with a faint nod, something she rarely did with other staff. The tension that had gripped the room for hours seemed to ease, just a little, as if the atmosphere itself had shifted. Other staff members noticed, exchanging surprised glances, quietly wondering if this new presence could actually withstand the pressure that had broken so many before. The young waitress did more than just follow procedures. She watched the bride carefully, learning to anticipate her needs. A glass of water refilled before it was empty, a dish placed at the exact moment, the lighting adjusted just enough to suit her comfort. Each small action built trust, even if it was unspoken, and the bride responded in ways that were subtle but meaningful. She did not smile broadly, nor did she give open praise, but the sharp tension in her posture relaxed ever so slightly. For those watching, it was a small miracle, a tiny crack in the armor of a woman everyone had feared. Other diners, noticing the difference, began to sense a change in the air. The bride, usually quiet and intimidating, seemed more approachable, though she still carried her commanding presence. It was a delicate balance. The room was aware that she remained a person of authority and power, yet the hostility and fear that usually followed her were noticeably reduced. The young waitress continued her careful service, adjusting, observing, and responding without hesitation or nervousness. Her calm, thoughtful manner made her stand out in ways that no one had expected. The shift continued, and the young waitress found herself gaining a rhythm. She wasn't just serving, she was connecting. Through small gestures and attentive care, she created an environment that the bride could tolerate and even, for the first time, enjoy. She remembered preferences without being intrusive, she anticipated movements without being prescriptive, and she maintained a warm, human presence that was different from the trembling staff members around her. It was clear to everyone that this interaction was unlike any other they had witnessed. The staff began to relax slightly too, inspired by the calm confidence of the new waitress. The usual whispers and anxious glances faded, replaced by quiet focus and efficiency. They began to see that fear was not the only approach to managing the bride's presence. There was a way to navigate her expectations with grace and intelligence, a method that didn't require trembling or endless worry. The atmosphere shifted subtly, with everyone noticing that the bridezilla aura, as it was often called, could be influenced by approach and attitude. As the evening went on, the bride began to engage in small ways. A question about the menu was answered politely, a subtle request acknowledged promptly. The waitress responded with attention and thoughtfulness, never overstepping, never drawing unnecessary attention to herself, but always present, always careful. The bride's usual critical gaze softened further, a sign that the interaction was building trust, even if tentative and unspoken. There were moments when the bride's attention seemed to drift, her thoughts elsewhere, yet the waitress noticed the shift and adjusted seamlessly. She moved dishes, refilled water, and offered subtle cues that showed she was aware and attentive. These were small, almost invisible acts, but they carried enormous weight in the context of the evening. The bride noticed, and though she did not comment directly, her calm nods and relaxed posture spoke volumes. The staff, watching from the sidelines, could hardly believe the transformation taking place in front of them. By the end of the evening, the young waitress had established a rapport that others could not. She had not tried to impress with grand gestures or flattery, but had instead relied on careful observation, patience, and simple human kindness. It was clear to everyone present that she had succeeded in doing something remarkable. She had interacted with the billionaire's bride in a way that did not invoke fear, but instead created an atmosphere of trust and calm. For the first time, staff and diners alike witnessed a side of the bride that few had ever seen, a woman capable of appreciating attentive care and human connection. The evening concluded without incident, and as the bride left, there was a quiet acknowledgement of the young waitress's success. Staff whispered in awe, sharing their amazement at how someone had managed to navigate a world that had intimidated even the most experienced employees. The bride's departure was as commanding as her arrival, but the change in atmosphere lingered, leaving the restaurant in a rare state of calm. It was clear that this encounter would be remembered by all who witnessed it. That night, in quiet moments after the shift, staff reflected on what had happened. They realized that fear was not the only tool for interacting with someone as intimidating as the billionaire's bride. Patience, observation, and genuine human care had created a breakthrough, proving that even the most daunting personalities could be approached successfully. It was a lesson that would be remembered for years, a story of how one person's calm and thoughtful presence could alter the dynamics of a room and change the experience of everyone involved. The young waitress herself felt a quiet satisfaction. She had entered a world of tension and fear and had navigated it with her own sense of poise and attentiveness. She did not boast or seek recognition, but the results were evident in the change she had inspired. The bride, usually feared and unapproachable, had been met with calm understanding, and for the first time, she had responded with a subtle openness that hinted at the possibility of more. The stage was set for a deeper story to unfold, one that would continue to explore the impact of human kindness, patience, and the courage to face fear with calm determination. The following days were a test of patience and observation for the young waitress. She knew that one evening of calm interaction was not enough to earn trust or create change. The restaurant was her stage, and every shift presented a new opportunity to learn more about the billionaire's bride. She arrived early, reviewing notes in her mind about preferences, gestures, and subtle cues. She had learned that nothing about this encounter was ordinary. Every detail mattered. When the bride arrived that evening, the atmosphere shifted immediately, though this time it was different. There was a faint curiosity in the bride's eyes, as if she wanted to see if the previous encounter was a fluke or a sign of genuine skill and understanding. The young waitress approached with the same calm confidence, greeting her warmly but without overdoing it. She noticed a small change in the bride's demeanor, a softer tone, a less rigid posture, and she responded in kind, adjusting her movements and gestures to reflect the subtle shift. She poured the tea at the right temperature, placed the utensils in the correct alignment, and moved with a quiet grace that spoke volumes without words. The bride observed, her eyes scanning the room, but not with the usual sharp judgment. Instead, there was a hint of surprise, a sense that the staff's anxiety was not needed in this interaction. The young waitress continued to anticipate her needs, providing water before it was requested, adjusting seating and napkin placement, as if she could feel the bride's comfort before it was expressed. As the evening went on, the bride began to engage in small conversations. She asked questions about the menu, not in a critical manner, but with genuine interest. The young waitress answered clearly and politely, offering insights without forcing opinion. It was a delicate dance, one that required attention, empathy, and awareness. She realized that the bride was not unapproachable because of cruelty or malice, but because people had consistently responded with fear rather than understanding. This insight guided her actions, making each interaction intentional and thoughtful. Other staff members observed quietly, learning from her example. They noticed the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the way tension melted slowly when approached with calm and consideration. Even the most experienced servers watched in awe, realizing that their previous efforts, based on anxious perfection, had been ineffective. The young waitress demonstrated that respect and attentiveness could achieve far more than fear and apprehension. Throughout the evening, small gestures built a silent connection. A dish delivered with care, a gentle smile, and attentive listening created a bridge between them. The bride, who had often responded with criticism, now offered brief nods of approval and subtle signs of acknowledgement. These gestures were tiny, almost invisible, but to the staff they were monumental. They signaled that the young waitress had begun to understand her, and perhaps more importantly, that the bride had begun to trust her presence. The young waitress also paid attention to moments when the bride's mood shifted. She noticed when she seemed tired, when a frown threatened to appear, and adjusted accordingly. She moved slowly, deliberately, making sure the environment around her remained calm. She learned that patience was key. Rushing or overcompensating could trigger the familiar tension, but careful observation allowed her to respond before any discomfort escalated. Over time, the bride began to show signs of openness. She asked more questions, shared small personal anecdotes, and even smiled occasionally. These moments were rare but significant, a sign that trust was growing. The young waitress did not take these gestures for granted. She continued her attentive service, maintaining balance between professionalism and warmth. It was a dance of subtlety, requiring constant focus and emotional intelligence. Staff noticed another remarkable change. The restaurant's energy shifted not only because of the bride's softened demeanor, but also because of the young waitress's influence. Anxiety levels decreased, steps were lighter, and even the air seemed less tense. It became clear that one person's approach could affect the entire environment, turning fear into calm and caution into thoughtful engagement. The young waitress also began to understand the bride's preferences beyond mere routines. She learned to read subtle expressions and small changes in posture, realizing that communication went far beyond words. A glance, a pause, or a shift in seating position could reveal more than a direct statement. By responding to these cues, she created an environment where the bride felt seen and understood, a rare and meaningful experience for someone who had been constantly feared. Even as the evening drew to a close, the bond, though still tentative, had strengthened. The bride acknowledged the young waitress's presence with a nod, a slight smile, and a gentle word of thanks. The staff, who had witnessed countless interactions with her in the past, recognized the significance. This was no ordinary service. This was a transformation in real time, a quiet breakthrough that demonstrated the power of empathy and patience. The young waitress reflected on her experience. She realized that the bride's fearsome reputation had been built not from malice, but from misunderstanding and the inability of others to meet her with calmness and respect. By remaining attentive and human, by observing and responding rather than fearing, she had begun to bridge a gap that many had deemed impossible. She understood that her role was not to impress or dominate, but to serve with intelligence, awareness, and heart. That night, as the restaurant emptied and the lights dimmed, the staff quietly discussed what they had witnessed. They spoke in hushed tones about the young waitress's skill, her calm approach, and the subtle ways she had changed the evening. It was a lesson in human connection, patience, and observation, a reminder that fear often creates the very tension it seeks to avoid. They realized that change was possible, and it began with someone who chose to see and respond with care rather than trembling. The young waitress felt a quiet satisfaction, not from recognition or praise, but from knowing that she had managed to create a small ripple of change in a world dominated by fear and caution. She had shown that understanding and empathy, coupled with careful observation, could alter not just the atmosphere of a room, but the behavior of someone as formidable as the billionaire's bride. And in that realization, she found not only confidence in her own abilities, but also hope for what could come next. As the story of connection and transformation continued to unfold in subtle but meaningful ways as the days passed, the young waitress found herself more comfortable navigating the presence of the billionaire's bride, and the bride herself began to show subtle signs of openness. The first encounters had been cautious, filled with observation and careful attention, but now there was a rhythm forming, a silent understanding that neither needed to speak aloud to recognize. The young waitress noticed that the bride's sharp gaze had softened, that her gestures were less rigid, and that there was a quiet curiosity behind the eyes that once seemed always judging. It began with small conversations. The bride would ask about the day's specials or inquire about the preparation of a particular dish. She did not do so with the critical tone that others had experienced, but with genuine interest, a willingness to engage in a simple exchange. The young waitress responded naturally, confident in her knowledge but careful not to overstep. She offered answers that were honest and helpful, never trying to impress but instead focused on clear and kind communication. Each interaction, though seemingly ordinary, became a building block of trust. The atmosphere in the restaurant transformed in subtle ways. The staff, who had previously been tense and anxious whenever the bride arrived, began to notice the difference. They saw that the young waitress's calm and attentive presence had a ripple effect, easing not only the bride's expectations but also the environment itself. The dining room felt lighter, less burdened by the tension that had once seemed inseparable from the billionaire's bride. Others began to mirror her approach, adopting patience, observation, and care, learning that empathy could achieve what fear never could. The young waitress also began to notice more personal details about the bride. She observed the way her posture changed when she was comfortable, the subtle shifts in expression that indicated satisfaction or displeasure, and the quiet habits that spoke to her personality. By responding to these cues, she was able to anticipate needs and provide a seamless experience. The bride, in turn, began to relax, engaging in small gestures of acknowledgement that were rare and meaningful. A nod here, a faint smile there, each one reinforcing a connection that had been unimaginable in the past. It was not a story of grand gestures or dramatic revelations, but of careful attention and human connection. The young waitress understood that the billionaire's bride was not unapproachable because of cruelty, but because she had been met with fear, misunderstanding, and distance. By offering attentiveness without judgment, patience without expectation, and kindness without pretense, she created an environment where the bride could be herself, even if only in small ways. It was a quiet revolution, invisible to most, but monumental to those involved. As the interactions continued, the bride began to share small pieces of herself. She would mention a memory from a past trip, a preference for a certain dish, or a fleeting thought about the day. These moments were brief and subtle, but they carried weight. The young waitress listened attentively, responding appropriately, creating a space where the bride felt safe to express herself. It was a delicate balance, a careful navigation of trust that had been earned gradually and thoughtfully. The restaurant staff observed these developments with a mixture of awe and curiosity. They realized that the young waitress had accomplished what many had considered impossible. She had changed the dynamic of interactions with the billionaire's bride. Fear was no longer the governing force. Attentiveness, empathy, and calm had created a new path. The staff began to reflect on their own approaches, learning that human connection could replace anxiety and tension, and that understanding could transform even the most intimidating encounters. Throughout the evening, the young waitress remained aware of every detail. She noticed when the bride seemed tired, when a subtle frown threatened to appear, and she adjusted her actions accordingly. She moved with quiet precision, anticipating needs without overstepping, offering comfort without intrusion. The bride responded, not with overt praise, but with signs of acknowledgement that were just as meaningful. A glance, a nod, a softening of expression, all indicated that trust was growing, and that the young waitress had earned a place of rare significance in her presence. The young waitress also noticed that her own confidence grew with each encounter. She had learned to navigate tension without fear, to anticipate needs without anxiety, and to communicate through actions as well as words. Her role was not simply to serve, but to create an environment of calm, understanding, and trust. She recognized that the billionaire's bride had been feared not because she was unkind, but because she had consistently been met with fear. By offering something different, she had changed the game entirely. As weeks went by, the interactions deepened. The bride began to relax further, asking more questions, engaging in longer conversations, and showing subtle appreciation for the young waitress's attentiveness. The staff noticed the transformation, not just in the bride's demeanor, but in the overall atmosphere of the restaurant. Anxiety had been replaced with quiet focus, tension with calm, and fear with human understanding. It was a lesson that extended beyond the immediate interaction, a reminder of the power of empathy and patience in changing perceptions and behavior. The young waitress also realized that her influence extended beyond the restaurant. She had become a quiet model for others, showing that fear and intimidation could be met with calmness and respect, and that understanding and human connection were far more powerful than apprehension. Her approach inspired other staff members to adopt similar methods, creating a ripple effect that transformed the environment and, ultimately, the experience of all who interacted with the billionaire's bride. The evenings continued in this manner, each one building upon the last. Small gestures, careful observation, and attentive service created a bond that was slowly strengthening. The bride, once feared and unapproachable, now responded with subtle signs of trust and openness. The young waitress had shown that human connection, patience, and attentiveness could alter even the most formidable presence, and that understanding and empathy could replace fear in ways that were meaningful and lasting. By the end of each shift, the young waitress felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. She had not sought recognition, nor had she attempted to impress with grand gestures. Instead, she had relied on observation, empathy, and careful attention, creating a change that was profound yet invisible to most. The billionaire's bride, for the first time, had experienced genuine care and understanding, and the ripple effects of this connection extended throughout the staff and the restaurant. It was a story of patience, trust, and human connection, a reminder that even the most intimidating personalities could be reached with calm, thoughtful, and kind engagement. The bond that had begun with small gestures and careful observation was now forming into a deeper understanding. The young waitress had navigated fear, observation, and subtle communication to create an environment where trust and empathy could flourish. The staff, the bride, and even the young waitress herself were part of a quiet transformation, one that demonstrated the power of human-centered interaction. The atmosphere was lighter, the tension diminished, and the possibility of further connection had opened in ways that no one had anticipated. The story was no longer about fear, but about the careful, deliberate creation of understanding, patience, and genuine human care. Over the following weeks, the bond between the young waitress and the billionaire's bride continued to grow, developing into something deeper than anyone in the restaurant could have imagined. The bride, once feared and intimidating, began to show a level of openness that had never been seen before. It was subtle at first, expressed through small gestures, the occasional smile, and questions that went beyond mere politeness. The young waitress had learned to recognize these signs, responding with gentle attentiveness and understanding, never taking anything for granted. Each evening brought new challenges and opportunities. The restaurant remained busy, but the young waitress moved through the chaos with calm precision. She anticipated the bride's needs, noticed the slight changes in mood, and adjusted her actions accordingly. When the bride seemed weary, she suggested small comforts without making a fuss. When the bride appeared curious, she offered information and insights without drawing attention to herself. It was a delicate balance, a dance of patience and observation that required constant attention and emotional awareness. The staff around them watched in quiet amazement. They had witnessed countless interactions with the billionaire's bride, usually filled with tension, fear, and rigid formality. Now they saw something different, a shift in energy, a subtle warmth that had been absent before. The young waitress had achieved what many thought impossible. She had transformed the environment not by confrontation or flattery, but by being attentive, empathetic, and composed. Her actions proved that genuine human connection could bridge even the most intimidating divides. The bride began to share more of herself. She spoke about her childhood, the pressures she faced growing up, and the constant expectations that had shaped her life. These moments were brief and careful, but they were significant. The young waitress listened, offering a safe space for expression without judgment or interruption. In return, the bride began to trust her presence, to rely on her guidance and subtle understanding. The bond that had started with simple attentiveness had grown into mutual respect and quiet friendship. Outside the restaurant, the bride's reputation slowly began to shift as well. Stories of her softer demeanor and newfound patience started to circulate. People who had once approached her with fear now spoke of a surprising openness and calmness. The young waitress's influence had created a ripple effect, demonstrating the power of empathy and human-centered interaction. Those who had once dreaded encounters with the bride began to see that fear was not the only response, and that understanding and care could change even the most formidable personalities. the young waitress herself felt a growing sense of confidence and purpose. She had navigated an environment that many found impossible, transforming tension into trust and fear into calm. Her approach had not relied on power or authority, but on simple human qualities: observation, patience, attentiveness, and empathy. Each interaction reinforced her understanding that real change was built through consistent, thoughtful actions rather than dramatic gestures or immediate results. One evening, the bride requested to sit at the young waitress's section again, a choice that was rare for her. She engaged in a longer conversation than before, asking about daily routines, expressing curiosity about the lives of those around her, and even sharing small personal reflections. The young waitress responded naturally, her tone warm but composed, her attention focused entirely on the interaction. It was a moment that felt ordinary to outsiders but extraordinary to those who had seen the bride's reputation firsthand. The bond between them became a model for others. The restaurant staff began adopting the same patient, observant approach in their own interactions. They noticed that small gestures, attentiveness, and empathy could create comfort and trust, replacing the anxiety that had dominated their work life. The young waitress had not only impacted the billionaire's bride, but had also inspired those around her, teaching a lesson in human connection that extended beyond any single interaction. As weeks turned into months, the relationship deepened further. The bride's trust in the young waitress was evident in subtle ways: a nod of acknowledgement, a request for her opinion, or the sharing of a private thought. These moments were not grand or dramatic, but they carried tremendous weight. They symbolized a profound shift, a movement from fear to trust, from isolation to connection. The young waitress had shown that careful observation, empathy, and patience could break down barriers that had seemed insurmountable. The restaurant continued to thrive, not just because of the quality of service or food, but because of the atmosphere that had been transformed. Guests noticed the difference, commenting on the welcoming, calm, and attentive environment. The billionaire's bride, once a symbol of fear, now contributed to a space where people felt seen and respected. The young waitress had become a catalyst for change, demonstrating that human understanding could have a lasting and meaningful impact. Every evening, as the restaurant settled and the lights dimmed, the young waitress reflected on her journey. She had entered a world dominated by fear, uncertainty, and rigid expectations, and she had navigated it with intelligence, patience, and empathy. Her success was not measured by praise or recognition but by the trust she had built, the bond she had formed, and the atmosphere she had helped transform. She understood that real influence comes not from authority or power but from consistent, thoughtful human connection. The billionaire's bride, too, experienced a transformation. The young waitress had shown her that she could be understood, that people could respond with care rather than fear, and that trust could replace suspicion. This shift allowed her to engage more openly with those around her, not just in the restaurant but in other aspects of her life. She learned that vulnerability could be met with respect and kindness, and that connection could replace isolation. The story of the young waitress and the billionaire's bride became more than a series of interactions. It became a lesson in human behavior, empathy, and understanding. It showed that fear often dominates because it is met with repetition and expectation, but that patience, attention, and genuine care can create profound change. It was a reminder that even the most intimidating individuals could be reached, that trust could be built, and that human connection could transform lives. In the end, the young waitress's impact extended beyond the restaurant walls. She had demonstrated that one person, by being observant, empathetic, and patient, could influence not just an individual but an entire environment. The billionaire's bride, once feared by all, had become a symbol of the possibility of change, a testament to the power of human-centered interaction. And the young waitress had proven that courage, understanding, and consistent care could transform fear into trust, isolation into connection, and intimidation into respect. The final evening of the series of encounters was quiet but significant. The bride expressed a small but sincere appreciation for the young waitress's care, a gesture that reflected months of trust-building and subtle connection. Staff members, who had witnessed this transformation from the beginning, quietly acknowledged the achievement. The restaurant felt lighter, warmer, and more human-centered than ever before. The young waitress had completed her journey from newcomer to quiet hero, demonstrating the profound impact of empathy, patience, and human understanding. It was a story that would be remembered not for drama or spectacle, but for the subtle, lasting power of genuine human connection.